To the town of Havenwood, the man in the dilapidated cabin at the forest's edge had no name. They called him the Ghost. His rare, hurried trips into town left only whispers and fearful glances in his wake. They rumored he was a dangerous eccentric, hiding dark secrets from his past inside his rotting fortress. But they didn't know that, when the most ferocious storm in a decade hit, it brought not only howling wind and lashing rain, but also a desperate cry in the night, a sound that would force the hermit to face the world and change everything they ever thought about him. To discover the secret that changed it all, please support us by subscribing to the channel. Where are you listening to this story from? The trees in Oregon held their secrets close. Ancient Douglas firs, their heads lost in a perpetual mist, stood like silent judges over the forest floor. Down below, where the light struggled to pierce the canopy, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying pine needles, and the clean, sharp smell of rain that was always either coming or just leaving. Tucked away in this deep, green silence, almost swallowed by it, was a structure that looked like a forgotten mistake. It was a cabin, though that word implied a rustic charm this place had long since surrendered. It was a one-story rectangle of wood that seemed to be losing its argument with gravity, leaning tiredly to one side. The tin roof, sagging in the middle, was a map of rust, its dark brown surface blooming with patches of angry orange. Warped, silver-gray planks formed the walls, some with gaps wide enough to invite the wind and the creeping tendrils of moss. One of the 3 windows was boarded over with a pale, water-stained sheet of plywood. The small porch roof slumped precariously, held up by a post that was visibly rotten at its base. The whole scene was framed by a riot of overgrown ferns and weeds, choking the life out of the small clearing. To the people in the nearby town of Havenwood, it was the home of the ghost they called Rick. Rick was 50 years old, though the hardship etched on his face could have belonged to a much older man. He was tall and lean, the way a person is when they carry no excess, only the dense, wiry strength of necessity. His brown hair was cut short, a military habit that had never left him, and a fine web of silver had claimed his temples. His face was all sharp angles and rough planes, a face carved by sun and sorrow, yet his eyes, a clear, pale gray, held a deep, buried kindness. He emerged from the cabin now, his movements quiet and deliberate. He wore a faded navy and beige plaid shirt over a plain gray t-shirt, the fabric worn soft with countless washings. His denim jeans were faded at the knees, and his sturdy work boots were scuffed and splattered with mud. He stepped onto the rickety porch, and the cracked wood groaned in protest. For a moment, he just stood there, his gaze distant, scanning the impassive trees as if they were a border he could never cross. Then, with a slow exhale that turned to smoke in the cold air, he turned back. The front door, its hunter-green paint almost entirely peeled away, scraped loudly against the floor as he pulled it open. The sound was a harsh violation of the forest's quiet. He slipped inside, and the door scraped shut again, plunging the world back into silence. To step from the outside of Rick's cabin to the inside was to step between 2 different worlds. The exterior was a testament to decay and chaos. The interior was a sanctuary of order and warmth. The air inside was clean, smelling of cedar, hot coffee, and the faint, pleasant aroma of the wood smoke from the stone fireplace. A single large room unfolded under a ceiling of sturdy, exposed beams. The silver-gray walls of the exterior were hidden here behind smooth, honey-colored wood panels that glowed in the soft light of a kerosene lamp. The floor was made of wide, dark planks, polished to a dull sheen, and swept completely clean of any dust or debris. This was Rick's fortress. Every object had its place. To the left stood a compact, orderly kitchen area. A small cast-iron stove sat next to a deep basin sink with a simple hand pump for water. On open shelves above, 4 ceramic mugs hung from hooks, perfectly aligned. Jars of rice, beans, and dried herbs were arranged by size. To the right was the living space. A single hand-carved armchair with a simple wool blanket folded over its back faced the stone fireplace. Next to it, a small table held a stack of 3 books, their spines perfectly flush. In the far corner, a bed was made with military precision, the dark green quilt pulled taut, not a single wrinkle to be seen. This was more than a home, it was a form of control. Out there, in the world beyond the trees, was chaos. It was the unpredictable noise, the shifting alliances, the judgment in strangers' eyes. It was the messy, uncontrollable flood of memory. But in here, every joint in the furniture he had built was perfect. Every tool in his small workshop at the back of the cabin hung in its designated spot. Here, he was the architect of his own small, manageable reality. It was the only way he knew how to keep the ghosts of his past at bay. His days followed a rhythm as unchanging as the seasons. He would wake before the sun, his heart often pounding from the nightly excursions back to desert sands and forgotten firefights. The dream would cling to him like sweat, the phantom sounds of shouting and explosions ringing in his ears. He would push himself out of bed, the movement sharp and mechanical, and light the stove. The simple act of making coffee, the smell, the warmth in his hands, was an anchor to the present. He would spend his mornings working with wood, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as they guided a chisel or a plane. He carved small, intricate animals, a hawk with its wings outstretched, a bear with its head raised to sniff the air. The focus required was a meditation, a way to silence the noise in his head. The afternoons were for upkeep, checking the seal on the windows, clearing fallen branches, ensuring his fortress remained secure. He spoke to no one, for there was no one to speak to. The isolation was a double-edged sword. It kept the world out, but it also kept him locked in with his own memories. Some nights were better than others. Some nights he could sit in his chair and read until the lamp burned low, the silence of the forest, a comforting blanket. But other nights, the silence was a vacuum, and his memories would rush in to fill it. On those nights, he would see the faces of friends long gone, hear their final words. He would wake up with a gasp, his hands clenched, the orderly peace of his cabin feeling like a fragile lie. It was on those nights he understood why he had built these walls, both wooden and emotional. The world had proven to be a place of profound pain, and this small, meticulously crafted space was the only place he had ever found that truly felt safe. The fortress required provisions. For all its self-contained order, Rick's cabin could not produce coffee beans, salt, or kerosene for the lamp that held the long nights at bay. The need to venture into town was a low, persistent hum of anxiety that grew louder over several days until it could no longer be ignored. On a crisp, overcast morning, Rick acknowledged the silent demand. He pulled on a thicker jacket, his movements stiff with reluctance, and headed for the old truck parked under a makeshift lean-to of rotting canvas. The vehicle was a reflection of its owner. It was a 20-year-old Ford pickup, its original blue paint faded to the color of a dull sky, with rust eating away at the wheel wells. But the engine, which he maintained with the same methodical precision as his home, turned over with a low, reliable rumble. The drive out of the forest was a slow retreat from safety. The narrow dirt track gave way to gravel, and finally to the cracked pavement of a county road. The trees grew less dense, and houses began to appear, neat and tidy, with manicured lawns that felt alien to him. Soon, he was on the main street of Havenwood. The town presented a postcard image of peaceful, small-town America. A bakery with a cheerful striped awning, a post office with a proudly flying flag, and a diner with the words, "Best Pies in Oregon," painted on the window. But for Rick, the quaint storefronts were like the eyes of a crowd, watching, judging. He parked the truck in front of Henderson's General Store, the last stop on the street, and took a deep, steadying breath before stepping out. The change was immediate. 2 women talking on the sidewalk fell silent as he approached, their smiles tightening as they turned their backs to him. A young boy on a bicycle wobbled to a halt, his eyes wide, until his mother quickly grabbed his arm and hurried him across the street. Rick kept his gaze fixed on the ground in front of him, his shoulders set in a rigid line. He was a ghost, a dark shape that disrupted the town's comfortable picture. Inside the store, the smell of sawdust, leather, and fresh produce did little to ease the tension in his chest. A few other customers milled about the aisles. They saw him enter, and a subtle choreography of avoidance began. A woman with a shopping basket quickly moved to the far end of the aisle he entered. A man examining canned goods suddenly found what he was looking for and scurried toward the checkout. Rick moved through the space with quiet efficiency, pulling items from the shelves without pausing. Flour, sugar, coffee, kerosene. His list was short, his purpose singular. Get in, get out. At the counter stood Mr. Henderson, the store's owner. He was an older man with a fringe of white hair around a bald head and spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He wasn't a cruel man, but he was a creature of the town, and his expression was one of wary neutrality. He watched Rick place his items on the wooden counter. "That be all for you today?" Mr. Henderson asked, his voice flat. "Yes," Rick said. His own voice sounded rough from disuse. The transaction was conducted in near silence, broken only by the beeping of the register and the rustle of paper bags. Rick paid with the exact amount in cash, avoiding any need for prolonged interaction. As Mr. Henderson handed him his change, their fingers brushed. The store owner flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but Rick saw it. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He took his bags and turned to leave, his jaw tight. Just as he reached the door, he heard a hushed voice from the next aisle. "Gives me the creeps every time he comes in here." "Hush, Martha. He'll hear you." "Well, it's true. They say he was some kind of special forces. You have to wonder what a man has to do to want to live like that. And all too empty." The truck felt like a diving bell, a sealed capsule protecting him from the crushing pressure of the world. As he drove away from Havenwood, the words of the woman echoed in his mind. You have to wonder what a man has to do. The rhythmic thump of the tires on the pavement became a trigger, pulling him back in time. The first memory was of noise. A welcome home ceremony in a gymnasium. The thunderous applause, the screech of the microphone, the well-meaning but overwhelming crush of people. They all wanted to shake his hand, to pat his back, to look at him like a hero. But their faces were a blur, their voices a deafening roar. He remembered the walls feeling like they were closing in, the air growing thin, a cold sweat breaking out on his skin as he searched desperately for an exit, for a sliver of silence in the suffocating chaos. He had felt more at ease on a silent, four-man patrol in enemy territory than he did in that room full of celebrating strangers. Another memory surfaced. A barbecue in a neighbor's backyard, a few months after his return. A man he barely knew, holding a beer, had cornered him by the grill. The man had a soft, clean face and an eager, morbid curiosity in his eyes. "So," the man had said, leaning in conspiratorially, "what's it really like? You guys see some crazy stuff, right? Is it like the movies?" The question was so naive, so profoundly ignorant of the weight he carried, that Rick felt a chasm open between them. How could he explain the smell of dust and cordite, the weight of a friend's body, the silence after a firefight? He had simply stared at the man, unable to form a single word until the man shuffled away awkwardly, labeling him as rude, as broken. That was the moment he understood. They didn't want to know the real him. They wanted a simple story, a hero or a monster. Anything but the complicated, wounded truth. When the leaning shape of his cabin finally appeared through the trees, a wave of relief so powerful it almost made him dizzy washed over him. He parked the truck and carried the bags inside. The scraping of the door, the sweetest sound he had heard all day. He was home. He was safe. He put the supplies away, each item finding its designated spot on the shelves. The simple act, restoring a sense of order to his frayed nerves. As he stepped back outside to gather some kindling, a flash of movement near the rotted porch steps caught his eye. A small sparrow lay on the ground, its body trembling, one of its wings bent at an unnatural angle. All the tension, all the rigid defense he had carried with him all day, melted away. He knelt, his movements slow and gentle. The real Rick, the man no one in Havenwood ever saw, looked at the frightened creature with an expression of pure, unfiltered empathy. He carefully scooped the tiny bird into his large, rough hands, cradling it against his chest. Inside his fortress, away from the whispers and the stares, he sat at his workbench. With the delicate touch of a surgeon, he used a twig from the kindling box and a thread pulled from his sewing kit to fashion a minuscule splint for the broken wing. He worked in complete silence, his focus absolute, his breathing slow and steady. Here, in the quiet of his sanctuary, was a life he could save. Here was something broken he knew how to mend. For 2 days, a fragile peace settled over Rick's clearing. He cared for the injured sparrow, which he kept in a small wooden box filled with soft cotton from an old t-shirt. He would feed it crushed seeds and water from an eyedropper, his large, scarred fingers moving with an astonishing gentleness. The small, trusting life was a quiet companion, its presence a warm flicker in the vast silence of his world. But on the 3rd morning, the silence changed. It grew heavy, oppressive. The usual morning chorus of birdsong was absent. The air, normally crisp and cool, became thick and still, charged with an unseen energy. Rick noticed it the moment he stepped onto his porch. He looked up. The sky was not blue, nor was it the familiar gray of an Oregon overcast. It was a strange, bruised yellow gray, and the clouds were moving in a low, fast-churning tide from the west. He could smell it in the air, a metallic tang of ozone and the scent of distant, wet earth. He had smelled atmospheres like this before, in different parts of the world. It was the smell of impending violence. A storm was coming. Not a simple squall, but a true Pacific brawler, born in the vast cold waters and now marching inland to spend its fury on the mountains. He went back inside, his movements losing their earlier gentleness and becoming sharp, efficient, and purposeful. The anxiety that gripped him in town was gone, replaced by a cold, familiar focus. This was not a social threat. This was a tactical problem, a physical enemy with predictable behaviors. This was a fight he knew how to prepare for. His first action was to bring the sparrow's box inside and place it on a low shelf far from any windows or drafts. He then began to secure his perimeter. He climbed a rickety ladder he kept leaning against the side of the cabin and, with a hammer and a handful of roofing nails, secured the loose corner of the tin roof that he knew would rattle and tear in a high wind. Back on the ground, he moved around the cabin, checking the seals on his 3 windows, pushing a little extra caulk into a crack he found in one of the frames. He took the flimsy sheet of plywood off the broken window and replaced it with a solid slab of thick wood he had cut for this exact purpose, fastening it securely from the inside. He worked without haste, his actions economical and precise. He brought in enough firewood from the messy outdoor pile to last for 2 days, stacking it neatly and tightly against the wall by the fireplace. He went to his old truck and made sure the canvas cover was tied down securely over the bed. His final preparation was for water. He disconnected the downspout to his main rain barrel, not wanting the first deluge of pine needles and debris from the roof to contaminate his supply. He filled every available container he had, lining them up on his kitchen counter. He was securing his fortress. Each hammered nail, each stacked log, was an act of defiance against the coming chaos. It was a familiar routine, a battle drill that settled his nerves and sharpened his mind. By midday, the light outside had faded to a gloomy twilight. The wind began to pick up, starting as a low moan through the high branches of the firs. Then, the first drops of rain fell. They were not a gentle mist, but heavy, fat drops that splattered loudly on the rusted roof, each one sounding like a thrown pebble. Within minutes, the scattered drops became a torrent. The moan of the wind escalated into a deep, guttural howl that seemed to come from all directions at once. The storm hit the small cabin not as weather, but as a physical assault. The wind slammed into the leaning structure, and the whole building groaned, the old timbers straining against the force. The rain was no longer falling. It was being driven sideways, a solid sheet of water that hammered against the wooden walls and blurred the windows into streaming, opaque sheets. Inside, Rick lit his kerosene lamp. Its steady, golden glow pushed back against the encroaching darkness, creating a small, warm island of calm in the heart of the storm. He added a log to the fire, and it caught with a satisfying crackle, the flames dancing merrily. He was calm. He was prepared. He sat in his hand-carved armchair, watching the fire, listening to the symphony of destruction outside. The sound was immense. The deep, continuous roar of the wind was like a freight train that never passed. The rain on the tin roof was a deafening, percussive drumming that drowned out all other thought. Every few minutes, a powerful gust would hit the cabin like a battering ram, and the building would shudder violently. A high-pitched whistle began to sound from a tiny gap in a window frame, a thin, frantic voice in the deep chorus of the storm. The trees outside, which normally stood so stoic and silent, were now thrashing wildly, their branches whipping back and forth in a desperate dance. Rick watched, his face impassive, as a large branch tore loose from a nearby fir and was flung through the air, disappearing into the gray chaos. He felt the cabin's vulnerability. He felt the strain in the groaning wood, the shudder that ran through the floorboards with each powerful gust. This fortress he had built, this sanctuary of meticulous order, was at the mercy of a force infinitely greater than himself. The world he had so carefully shut out was now trying to tear its way in. He was not afraid, but he was humbled, a solitary man in a small wooden box, listening as the full, untamed fury of the wild world raged against his walls, and the storm was only just beginning. Hours passed. The world outside the cabin was reduced to a formless, roaring chaos. Rick remained in his chair, a still point in the swirling storm. The fire crackled. The lamp burned with a steady, unwavering light. His fortress was holding. The walls groaned under the assault of the wind, and the roof shuddered with the constant drumming of the rain, but the sanctuary remained intact. He was a captain on the bridge of a small, besieged ship, riding out a hurricane. He was in his element, a place of tangible danger he could understand and endure. It was in a brief lull, a moment when the wind's deafening roar momentarily subsided to a deep, guttural moan, that he first heard it. It was a thin, high sound, almost lost in the greater noise. He tilted his head, listening. It was probably just a branch scraping against the tin roof in a strange way, or the wind catching a loose piece of bark and making it whistle. He dismissed it. The storm was playing tricks on his ears, creating phantom noises in its vast, violent symphony. He settled back into his chair, his gaze returning to the hypnotic dance of the flames. But then he heard it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. It rose between the shrieking gusts of wind, a sound that did not belong to the storm. It was a howl. It was long and desperate, a thread of pure, living misery, weaving its way through the inorganic fury of the wind and rain. It was a sound of pain so profound it felt like a needle piercing the thick blanket of noise. It was not the howl of a wild wolf, territorial and strong. It was the sound of a domestic creature, lost and terrified, and in its final extremity, it was the sound of hope draining away. Rick sat perfectly still, the wooden hawk he had been polishing resting forgotten in his hand. Every muscle in his body was tense. His fortress, his sanctuary, had been breached, not by the wind or the rain, but by that single, heartbreaking sound. His first instinct, born of years of self-imposed isolation, was to block it out. "It's not your problem," a voice in his head insisted. "It's just an animal. Nature is cruel. Out there is chaos and death. In here is safety. You built these walls for a reason. Do not open the door." The voice was rational. It was the voice of survival, the same voice that had kept him alive in the desert. Going out into that maelstrom was madness. For what? A lost dog? An animal that was likely already beyond help? His peace was a fragile, hard-won thing. To invite the chaos of the outside world in, even for a moment, was to risk shattering it completely. He closed his eyes, trying to focus on the warmth of the fire, the solid feel of the chair beneath him. He tried to unhear the sound, but it came again, fainter this time, as if the life behind it was fading. And with it, another voice rose up inside him, a voice he had not heard in a long time. It was the voice of the soldier. It was the voice of the man who had once been part of a team, part of a brotherhood where the deepest creed was brutally simple. You do not leave anyone behind, ever. His mind flashed with an image, not of combat, but of a young private, barely 19, who had twisted his ankle during a long march under a punishing sun. The boy had told the sergeant to leave him, to let him catch up later. The sergeant had looked the boy in the eye and said, "We all go home, or none of us do." Was this dog a soldier? Number. Was this a life he was sworn to protect? Number. But it was a life. It was a creature in need, crying out for help in the darkness. And he was here, safe and warm, listening to it die. The thought landed in his gut like a stone. The safety of his fortress suddenly felt shameful. The warmth of his fire felt like the heat of cowardice. The walls he had built to protect himself from the world would become his prison if he let them stop him from doing a simple, decent thing. The internal battle was fierce, but it was not long. The man who tended to a sparrow's broken wing could not sit idly by while a larger creature suffered. The soldier could not abandon a post. His jaw tightened. The decision was made. He stood up, his movements once again becoming methodical and sure. He went to a large wooden chest at the foot of his bed and pulled out his old military-issue rain gear. It was heavy, oiled canvas, made to withstand the worst conditions. He pulled on the thick pants and the hooded jacket, the familiar weight of it a comfort. He lit his storm lantern, the kind with a glass shield, to protect the flame from the wind. Its bright, clean light, a stark contrast to the lamp's soft glow. He found a coil of rope and slung it over his shoulder, then took up a heavy, smooth walking stick he had carved from an oak branch. He was armed not for a fight, but for a rescue. He stood before the door, the last barrier. For years it had been his shield, the boundary between his orderly world and the chaos beyond. Now he had to open it. He put his hand on the rusted iron latch, took a deep breath, and pulled. The storm exploded into the cabin. A furious blast of wind and water tore into the room, sending papers flying and making the fire in the hearth hiss and sputter. The warmth was sucked out in an instant, replaced by a biting, wet cold. Rick braced himself against the door, to keep it from being ripped from its hinges. He took one last look at the warm, safe sanctuary behind him. Then he stepped out onto the groaning porch, pulling the heavy door shut against the storm's invasion. He was outside. The wind tore at him, and the rain felt like 1,000 tiny needles against his face. He stood for a moment, a solitary figure against the roaring blackness, his only guide the small, defiant circle of light, thrown by his lantern as he prepared to step into the heart of the chaos he had so long avoided. The moment Rick stepped off the rotting porch, the storm consumed him. The wind hit him like a solid wall, stealing his breath and trying to rip the lantern from his hand. The rain was a cold, driving force, plastering his heavy coat to his body and finding its way down his collar. The world beyond the small dancing circle of his lantern's light was a churning vortex of black and gray, a terrifying blend of lashing branches, flying leaves, and solid sheets of water. He lowered his head, bracing his body against the gale, and moved forward. The ground was a treacherous soup of mud and slick, decaying leaves. Unseen roots threatened to grab his ankles with every step. He followed the memory of the sound, but the wind was a cruel trickster. It tore the howl to shreds, making it seem to come from his left, then his right, then from everywhere at once. For long minutes, there was only the roar of the storm, and he began to wonder if he had imagined it. a ghost sound created by a lonely mind. But then, through the chaos, it came again. Fainter, but closer this time. A pained, desperate cry that was nearly swallowed by a gust of wind. It was enough. It gave him a direction. He pushed through a thicket of dripping ferns, his boots sinking deep into the mud, and aimed his lantern toward the base of a dark, massive shape. It was an old fir tree, a giant that had finally lost its long battle with the wind and had fallen, its massive root ball ripped from the earth. Under the partial shelter of its splintered trunk, huddled in a shallow depression, was a shape, a living shape. Rick moved closer, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm in his chest. It was a dog, a large German shepherd. He was beautiful, or would have been. His thick coat was a rare and striking mix of dark, charcoal gray across his back and down his intelligent face, which softened to a silvery white on his chest and legs. But now, that beautiful coat was matted with mud and burrs, soaked through and plastered to his thin frame. He was maybe 2 or 3 years old, still in his prime, but shivering violently from cold and fear. One of his hind legs was tucked beneath him at a sickeningly wrong angle, and the ground beneath it was dark with blood. The dog lifted his head as Rick's light fell upon him, and his eyes, a deep, intelligent amber, were wide with a terror so absolute it made Rick's own breath catch. A low, pained growl rumbled in the dog's chest. It was not a threat. It was a plea. A warning born of utter despair and a profound distrust of the world. "Easy now," Rick said, his voice low and calm, barely audible over the storm. "Easy, boy. I'm not going to hurt you." He did not move closer. He knew better. A wounded, terrified animal was a dangerous one. He crouched down, making himself smaller, and kept the lantern held low and to the side, so its light was not a direct threat. He just stayed there, getting soaked by the relentless rain, letting the dog see him, letting him hear the steady calm in his voice. "It's all right," he murmured, the words almost a prayer. "You're in a bad spot. Let me help you." He spoke about nothing in particular. He spoke about the rain, about the wind, about how it was a cold night. He just let the sound of a human voice, stripped of all aggression, wash over the terrified animal. Slowly, painstakingly, the growl subsided, replaced by a low whimper. The dog's shivering intensified. Rick knew he had to act. He began to move forward, one slow, deliberate step at a time, never breaking the low, soothing murmur of his voice. When he was just a few feet away, he stopped, extended a slow, open hand, and waited. The dog watched his hand, his amber eyes tracking the movement, but he did not growl. After a long moment, he lowered his head, a gesture of complete, exhausted surrender. Getting him back to the cabin was a brutal, agonizing journey. The dog was heavy and unable to put any weight on his injured leg. Rick had to half lift, half guide him, his own muscles straining, his boots slipping in the mud. The dog cried out in pain several times, a sound that cut Rick deeper than the cold. But they moved together, a strange, wounded pair, fighting their way through the storm. Finally, the dim, welcoming shape of the cabin appeared. He guided the dog up the treacherous porch steps and leaned him against the wall. With a final, desperate effort, he pulled open the heavy door. The storm roared into the cabin behind them, and then Rick kicked the door shut. The silence was absolute. It was so sudden and so complete that it was disorienting. The deafening roar of the wind and rain was gone, replaced by the gentle crackle of the fire and the quiet hiss of the lantern. The air was warm and smelled of cedar. The light was soft and golden. The dog froze on the floor just inside the door, his body a knot of tense muscles. He dripped a puddle of muddy water onto the polished floorboards. His amber eyes, wide with shock, darted around the room, taking in the impossible peace of the space. He looked at the fire, at the sturdy armchair, at the neatly stacked books. He was a creature born of chaos and pain, and he had just been dropped into a world of impossible warmth and order. He trembled, but this time it was not from cold. It was from pure, unadulterated shock. And as Rick stood there, dripping and exhausted, looking at the terrified animal he had just dragged into his sanctuary, he felt a mirror of that same shock. For the first time in years, another living, breathing soul was inside his fortress. A piece of the wild, unpredictable, and wounded world he had shut out was now standing in the middle of his orderly floor. His routine was shattered. His solitude was broken. He looked at the dog, and the dog looked back at him, and in the profound, warm silence of the cabin, two lost souls, one human and one animal, stood in a state of shared, bewildered disbelief. The storm had broken by morning, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily silent. Sunlight, pale and watery, filtered through the trees, casting long shadows into the cabin. Inside, the standoff continued. Duke remained huddled in the corner where he had collapsed the night before, a dark, miserable shape on the floor. Rick moved with a deliberate slowness, adding a log to the fire and putting a pot of coffee on the stove, his every action measured and non-threatening. The immediate crisis of the storm was over, but a new, more delicate challenge had begun. The casualty needed tending to. Rick knew from a single look at the dog's leg that the wound was serious and needed to be cleaned properly to prevent infection. He gathered his supplies from a worn, olive-drab canvas bag, his own military first aid kit. It contained antiseptic wipes, sterile gauze, and a small suture kit. He filled a basin with warm water from the stove and approached the dog. He moved, not as a master, but as a medic approaching a wounded soldier on the battlefield. He crouched low, keeping his center of gravity down, his movements fluid and calm. "All right, let's get a look at that," he said softly, his voice a low rumble. As he got closer, Duke's fear ignited. A deep growl vibrated in his chest, and his upper lip curled back to reveal a flash of white teeth. His amber eyes were locked on Rick, filled with a clear warning. He was hurt and terrified, and he would fight to defend himself from more pain. Rick stopped. He did not challenge the growl or try to dominate the animal. He simply held his position, the basin of water in his hands, and kept talking. "I know it hurts," he murmured. "I know you're scared, but this has to be done. We have to get it clean." He dipped a clean rag into the warm water and squeezed it out, showing the dog his empty hands before reaching slowly, carefully, toward the injured leg. Duke flinched violently as Rick's fingers made contact, but it was the professional, confident nature of the touch that seemed to confuse him. Rick's hands were not aggressive. They were firm, steady, and purposeful. He worked with an efficiency that left no room for hesitation. He gently cleaned the mud and debris away from a deep, ragged gash on the dog's thigh. Duke whimpered, a high, pained sound, and his body trembled, but the warning growl subsided. He seemed to sense, in some primal way, that this pain was different. This was the pain of healing. Rick disinfected the wound, the dog letting out a sharp yelp, then expertly wrapped the leg in a clean bandage of gauze. When it was done, he retreated, leaving the dog alone with his newly clean wound. For the rest of the day, a silent treaty existed between them. Rick knew that trust, once shattered, was not easily rebuilt. He could not force it. He had to let the dog come to him in his own time. He placed a shallow bowl of fresh water near the corner where Duke lay. Later, he opened a can of beef stew he had been saving and spooned a small portion into another bowl, placing it beside the water. Then he retreated. He sat in his armchair by the fire, picked up a piece of wood, and began to carve, seemingly ignoring the new presence in his home. But he was aware of every tiny movement. He watched from the corner of his eye as Duke, after an hour of tense stillness, finally lifted his head. The dog's nose twitched, catching the scent of the food. Hunger was a powerful motivator. Duke watched Rick intently, looking for any sign of a trap, any hint of aggression. He saw none. He saw only a man, sitting quietly, his hands busy with a piece of wood, lost in his own world. Slowly, painfully, Duke pushed himself up and limped the few feet to the bowls. He drank the water first, long and deep, then devoured the stew in a few desperate gulps. He kept his eyes on Rick the entire time, ready to flee. Rick never looked up. He gave the dog the dignity of his privacy, sensing that being watched in this vulnerable state would feel like a threat. When he was finished, Duke retreated to his corner and lay down, letting out a long, shaky sigh. The slow thaw had begun. The rhythm of the next 24 hours was one of quiet patience. Rick would replace the water, offer small amounts of food, and once in the morning and once at night, he would approach slowly to check and redress the wound. Each time, Duke's growl was a little less certain, his posture a little less defensive. He was learning the man's movements, the calm rhythm of his existence. He was learning that the hands that brought pain also brought food and clean water. He was learning the sound of a voice that never shouted. The breakthrough came on the second night. The storm was a distant memory, and the forest was wrapped in a profound peace. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin was filled with long, soft shadows. Rick sat in his chair, watching the embers pulse. Duke was not in his corner. He was lying on an old, folded blanket that Rick had placed a little closer to the warmth of the hearth. His breathing was even, but a low whimper escaped him, and his good legs twitched, caught in the grip of a bad dream. Rick rose from his chair without a sound and knelt on the floor a few feet away from the sleeping dog. He didn't reach out. He just waited. After a moment, Duke's eyes blinked open, hazy with sleep and fear. He saw the man, and his body tensed. "It's all right, boy," Rick whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "You're safe here." It sighed. He slowly extended his hand, not reaching for the dog's head, but simply holding it out, palm down, in the space between them. It was an offering, not a demand. Duke stared at the hand. He could smell the scent of wood, soap, and something else, something fundamentally calm. He looked from the hand to Rick's face, at the sad, kind eyes that watched him without judgment. For a long moment, he was still. Then, he made a choice. He leaned forward, just an inch, and pressed his nose gently into Rick's palm. Then he rested his head against Rick's outstretched hand. Rick's breath hitched. He finally closed his hand, his fingers gently stroking the soft fur behind the dog's ears. Duke did not pull away. Instead, he let out a long, slow sigh, a sound of profound release, and closed his eyes. In the quiet of the cabin, in the warm glow of the dying fire, the first fragile thread of a bond had been woven between two lonely, wounded souls. That first tentative touch marked a turning point. A silent agreement was made in the warm, firelit cabin that night. The days that followed settled into a new kind of rhythm, a shared solitude that was fundamentally different from the empty loneliness that had defined Rick's life for years. The silence was no longer absolute. It was punctuated by the soft thump of Duke's tail against the wooden floor when Rick approached with his food, or the quiet sigh the dog would let out as he settled onto his blanket by the fire. And Rick, for the first time in a decade, began to speak. It started with small, practical things, instructions murmured, as if he were thinking aloud. "All right, let's see this leg." Or, "Easy now, this antiseptic stings a little." Duke would watch him, his head cocked, his amber eyes seeming to understand the tone, if not the words. The dog's presence was a steady, non-judgmental constant, and the oppressive weight of the cabin's silence began to lift. The words, locked away for so long, began to find their way out. One afternoon, Rick was at his workbench, carefully carving a small block of pine. Duke lay a few feet away, his chin resting on his paws, his gaze fixed on Rick's hands. The only sounds were the scrape of the knife against the wood and the crackle of the fire. "I used to know a guy, Sergeant Miller," Rick said, his voice quiet, directed at the dog. "He tried to teach me how to play poker. He was terrible at it. You could always tell when he was bluffing because his left ear would get red." Rick paused, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. He had a wife back in Texas. Wrote to her every single day. He used to read parts of her letters to us. She had a dog. A big, dumb, happy golden retriever. He looked over at Duke, who blinked slowly. He would have liked you. The stories began to spill out, fragments of a life he had kept buried. He spoke of young PFC Evans, a kid from Ohio who could sleep through anything, and of the quiet medic, Doc Jensen, who always had a spare pair of dry socks for anyone who needed them. He never spoke of the firefights, of the blood, and the chaos. He spoke of the men. He spoke of their jokes, their fears, their small kindnesses. He was not reliving the trauma. He was resurrecting the people, giving them voice again in the quiet safety of his fortress. And Duke listened, a silent, attentive shadow, offering the simple, profound gift of his presence. He was the perfect confidant, a keeper of secrets who would never judge, never question, and never look away. The nights, once the most difficult part of Rick's existence, began to change as well. The nightmares still came. The ghosts of the desert still stalked the edges of his sleep, but they no longer had the same power. One night, a particularly bad one threw him from his sleep. He sat bolt upright, his heart hammering against his ribs, the metallic taste of fear in his mouth, the phantom smell of smoke and dust filling his nostrils. He was disoriented, his mind caught between the dark, orderly cabin and a sun-scorched, hostile landscape half a world away. But before the panic could take full hold, he felt a wet nose press insistently into his clenched fist. He looked down. Duke had limped over from his blanket and was now standing beside the bed, his head resting on the mattress, his amber eyes full of a deep, knowing concern. Rick's frantic breathing began to slow. He reached out and buried his hand in the thick, warm fur of the dog's neck. The fur was real. The solid, living warmth of the dog was real. Duke was an anchor, a living anchor that pulled him out of the treacherous currents of the past and secured him firmly in the present. He wasn't in the desert. He was in his cabin. He was safe, and he was not alone. From that night on, Duke slept on the floor beside Rick's bed. As the days turned into a week, Duke's leg began to heal. The limp became less pronounced, and he started to put more weight on it. His trust in Rick grew with each passing day, blossoming in the quiet routine of food, warmth, and gentle care. One evening, as Rick was changing the bandage for the last time, he let his hand run along the dog's side, feeling the ribs that were now less prominent than when he had arrived. As he stroked the thick gray fur just behind Duke's shoulder, his fingers brushed against something hard and ropey beneath the skin. Curious, he gently parted the fur. There, stark against the dog's pale skin, was a long, thin, puckered scar. It was old and fully healed, a pale white line where no fur grew. It was not the kind of scar a dog would get from a fight with another animal. It was too straight, too uniform. It looked like it had been made by a rope or a whip. Rick's hands fell still. He looked from the ugly scar to Duke's face. The dog met his gaze, and in his eyes, Rick saw it all. The deep, ingrained fear of a raised hand, the ingrained distrust of sudden movements, the memory of a pain that had nothing to do with a storm or a fallen tree. It was the memory of human cruelty. A wave of profound, gut-wrenching empathy washed over Rick. He had been so focused on Duke as a victim of a natural disaster, he hadn't truly considered the life the dog had lived before the storm. He saw now that the storm had not been the beginning of Duke's suffering, only the latest chapter. He looked at the scar, then back at the trusting amber eyes. A bond of shared experience, deeper than he could have imagined, snapped into place between them. They were more alike than he knew. They had both seen the worst of the world. They had both been wounded by it. "You're a soldier too, aren't you?" Rick whispered, his voice thick. "Fought your own war. I see it now." Duke seemed to understand. He leaned forward and licked Rick's hand once, a gesture of quiet confirmation. In that moment, they were no longer just a man and his dog. They were two survivors, two veterans of different, brutal battlefields, who had, by some miracle, found a shared sanctuary in which to heal. With Duke's leg almost fully healed, a new routine took shape. The confines of the cabin, once a sufficient universe for one, now felt too small for two. Every afternoon, after Rick finished his work, he would take a length of rope, loop it gently around Duke's thick neck, and they would walk. These were not mere strolls. They were patrols, explorations into the deep woods that surrounded the cabin. The forest, battered and bruised by the storm, was in a state of recovery, and in a way, so were they. Rick watched as Duke's confidence grew with each step. The timid, terrified creature he had carried out of the storm was gone, replaced by a strong, alert companion. Duke moved with the easy grace of his breed, his nose constantly working, reading the secret stories of the forest floor. He would chase squirrels, investigate strange sounds with a low, curious woof, and always, he would circle back to check on Rick, his amber eyes seeking confirmation, his tail giving a slow, steady wag. For Rick, these walks were a revelation. He was no longer just a hermit in the woods. He was a man walking his dog. The simple act was so profoundly normal, it felt revolutionary. One afternoon, they ventured further than usual, following a game trail that wound its way up a steep, pine-covered ridge. The air was cool and clean. Duke was trotting just ahead when he suddenly stopped dead. His entire body went rigid. His head went up, his ears swiveled, and his nose began to work the air with an intensity Rick had never seen before. He let out a low, anxious whine, a sound completely different from his usual playful noises. He looked back at Rick, his eyes wide with urgency, and then pulled against the rope, trying to lead him off the trail and down into a dense, unfamiliar ravine. "What is it, boy?" Rick asked, his own senses suddenly on high alert. He trusted the dog's instincts completely. "What did you find?" He allowed Duke to lead him. They plunged into the thick undergrowth, branches whipping at their faces. Duke was relentless, pulling and whining, his focus absolute. After a few minutes of difficult progress, Rick saw it. A small splash of bright pink against the muted greens and browns of the forest. It was a child's hair clip, lying half buried in the damp leaves. A cold knot of dread formed in Rick's stomach. A little further on, Duke stopped beside the base of an enormous, moss-covered cedar tree. Huddled in a hollow between two large roots was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. She was wearing a bright red jacket, which was now damp and dirty, and her blonde hair was in messy pigtails. Her small face was streaked with tears and dirt, and she was shivering uncontrollably, her arms wrapped around her knees. Her name was Lily. She looked up as they approached, her blue eyes wide with a terror that was heartbreakingly familiar to Rick. Rick's first instinct was a surge of pure panic. A child from the town. This was a complication of a magnitude he could not have imagined. His hermit-like existence was built on avoiding all human contact. Being found in the deep woods with a lost little girl, his mind raced with how the people of Havenwood would twist this. The ghost of the woods, the dangerous recluse, a child. But then he looked at her small, trembling form, and the soldier took over. The protector. The man who mended a sparrow's wing. He knelt down slowly, just as he had with Duke. "Hey there," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "It's okay, you're safe now." Lily flinched, pressing herself further into the tree. Her eyes darted from Rick to the large dog at his side. Sensing her fear, Duke let out another soft whine and took a step forward, nudging her small, cold hand with his wet nose. The girl looked at the dog, and her fear seemed to lessen just a fraction. "He's a good dog," Rick said. "His name is Duke. He's the one who found you." He shrugged off his heavy flannel shirt, leaving him in just his t-shirt. "Here, you must be cold." He gently draped the warm, dry shirt over her shoulders. He then took a granola bar from his pocket, broke it in half, and offered it to her. She took it with trembling fingers and began to eat ravenously. "We need to get you home," Rick said gently. "Can you walk?" She shook her head, too exhausted and scared to speak. Rick nodded. Without another word, he carefully lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected. She stiffened for a moment, then, feeling his steady strength, she relaxed against his chest, her small body still shivering. With Duke leading the way, they began the long trek back toward the town. Rick moved with a steady, ground-eating pace, his anxiety warring with his sense of duty. As they neared the edge of the forest, they began to hear shouts. "Lily! Lily!" The sounds of a search party. Rick's heart pounded. This was it. The confrontation he had spent years avoiding. They broke through the tree line into a clearing. A group of people stood there, their faces etched with worry in the fading afternoon light. Among them was a frantic-looking couple, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, and a man with a weary, authoritative air wearing a sheriff's uniform, Sheriff Brody. For a tense second, everyone froze. They saw the image they had all secretly feared, the strange man from the woods emerging from the shadows. But the image was all wrong. He was not a monster. He was carrying the child they were all looking for, wrapped in his own shirt, with a large, beautiful dog at his side. "Lily!" the woman shrieked, a sound of pure, agonized relief. She ran forward, and the spell was broken. "Mommy!" the little girl cried, reaching out. Rick gently set her down, and she ran into her mother's arms. The father, Mr. Peterson, rushed to them, his face crumbling with emotion. He looked up at Rick, his eyes filled with tears, and a gratitude so profound it left him speechless. Sheriff Brody walked over, his expression cautious but no longer suspicious. He was a practical man in his 50s, with tired eyes that had seen a lot. "What happened?" he asked, his voice even. Rick felt the eyes of the whole search party on him. He felt exposed, his defenses stripped away. He gestured with his chin toward Duke, who now sat calmly at his side. "The dog found her," Rick said, his voice quiet. He picked up her scent. She was down in a ravine by the old cedar. Sheriff Brody looked from Rick to the girl now safe in her parents' arms and down to the calm German shepherd. He had heard all the stories about the man in the woods. He had always taken them with a grain of salt. Now, he saw the truth. He saw a quiet, capable man who had, without any thought for himself, saved a child's life. Mrs. Peterson, still clutching Lily, came over to Rick. "Thank you," she sobbed, the words choked with emotion. "Oh God, thank you. We were so scared." Rick just gave a short, awkward nod, completely overwhelmed by the raw emotion. He took a step back, wanting nothing more than to retreat into the shadows of the forest. "The dog did it all," he repeated. And then, before they could say anything more, he turned, gave a quiet command to Duke, and melted back into the trees, leaving behind a group of stunned and grateful people who were just beginning to realize that the ghost they had created in their minds was not a monster, but a quiet, unassuming hero. Rick had expected the silence to return after his retreat into the woods, but it was a different kind of silence. It was charged with anticipation. He felt like a soldier in a foxhole after a brief skirmish, listening for the sound of enemy movement. He spent the next day on edge, his routine feeling brittle and forced. He would find himself stopping his work to listen, straining to hear the sound of approaching footsteps, of the outside world coming to lay siege to his fortress. He had broken his own cardinal rule. He had engaged, and now he was waiting for the consequences. He did not have to wait long. Late the next afternoon, Duke, who was dozing by the fire, suddenly lifted his head, his ears perked, and let out a single, low woof, directed at the door. Rick's heart jumped into his throat. He moved to the grimy side window and peered out. A small group of figures was hesitantly making its way up the muddy path to his cabin. It was the Peterson family, Tom and Sarah Peterson, and holding her father's hand was the little girl, Lily. Rick's first instinct was to retreat into the shadows, to not answer the door, to pretend the cabin was as empty as it had been for years. His sanctuary was about to be invaded. But then he saw the look on their faces. It was not curiosity or suspicion. It was a gentle, nervous determination. And Lily, when she saw the cabin, did not look scared. She pointed and said something to her father, a small smile on her face. A quiet knock came at the door. Duke stood beside Rick, but he did not growl. He simply wagged his tail once, a gesture of recognition. Rick took a deep breath, the air feeling thin and tight in his lungs, and opened the door. "Mr. Rick," Tom Peterson said, his voice full of a respectful formality. He was a sturdy man with kind eyes, looking profoundly uncomfortable but resolute. "We are so sorry to bother you, but we had to come. We had to thank you properly." Sarah Peterson, her eyes still puffy from crying the day before, held out a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "We brought you something," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's not much. Just a hot stew and some fresh bread." Rick stood there, a stone in the doorway, completely unsure how to react. He wanted to take the basket, nod, and close the door. But Lily stepped forward, her small face tilted up at him. "Can I see Duke?" she asked, her voice clear and without a trace of fear. The simple, innocent question disarmed him completely. Before he could think, he found himself stepping back, holding the door open. "Come in," he heard himself say, the words feeling foreign in his own mouth. The Petersons stepped across the threshold, and the effect was instantaneous. They stopped dead, their mouths slightly agape. Their eyes traveled from the dilapidated, rotting porch they had just left to the impossible warmth and beauty of the room they now stood in. They took in the polished floor, the perfectly joined beams overhead, the glowing cedar walls, and the intricate, hand-carved furniture. Their gaze fell upon the mantel above the fireplace, where a collection of small wooden animals stood in a silent procession. A hawk, a bear, a wolf, each one carved with breathtaking detail and life. "My goodness," Sarah whispered, her hand coming up to her mouth. Did you make all of this?" Rick felt a flush of heat rise in his neck. He was used to being looked at with fear or pity. To be looked at with awe was a deeply unsettling experience. He gave a short, curt nod, unable to speak. Lily, meanwhile, had gone straight to Duke, who met her with a happy sniff and a sweep of his tail. She gently stroked his back, her small hand confident and kind. The visit was awkward but warm. The Petersons did not stay long, sensitive to Rick's visible discomfort. But in those few minutes, the walls of his fortress had been breached not by an enemy, but by simple human gratitude. When they left, the silence that returned to the cabin felt different again. It was no longer charged with anxiety, but with a strange, echoing warmth. The next day brought another visitor. This time it was a woman in her late 40s, driving a mud-splattered Jeep. She had a kind, practical face, brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and wore jeans and a warm fleece vest. She knocked on the door with a firm, confident rap. When Rick opened it, she gave him a warm, open smile. "You must be Rick," she said. "I'm Dr. Evans, the town veterinarian. The Petersons were worried about your dog and asked if I might come out and take a look. They covered the cost, of course. I hope you don't mind." Her demeanor was so straightforward and friendly that Rick found it hard to refuse. He let her in. Dr. Evans was just as taken with the cabin's interior as the Petersons had been, but her admiration was quieter, more observant. "This is incredible work," she said simply, running a hand over the smooth surface of his workbench. She was wonderful with Duke. She knelt on the floor, letting him sniff her hand before she began her examination, her movements gentle and sure, her voice a low, calming murmur. Duke, who was still wary of most people, seemed to relax under her touch. "Well," she said after a few minutes, "you've done an amazing job with this leg. It's clean, no sign of infection, and it's healing beautifully. You have a natural touch." She gave Duke a final, affectionate pat. "He's a very lucky dog." As she was packing her bag, her eyes once again fell on the carved animals on the mantel. She picked up the small wooden wolf, turning it over in her hands, her expression one of genuine appreciation. "You have a real gift, you know," she said, looking at him directly. Her gaze was kind, but it made him want to retreat. "The town's annual winter fair is in a few weeks. she continued, as if it were the most natural thought in the world. "It's a big deal. People come from all over the county. You should think about getting a booth. These carvings, people would love them. They would sell out in an hour." The suggestion landed in the quiet cabin like a dropped stone. A booth, the winter fair, a crowd of people, strangers, all of them, looking at him, talking to him, looking at his work. His work, the small, private things he made to keep the darkness at bay, to put them on display, to put a price on them, felt like a violation, like putting his own scarred soul up for sale. He shook his head slightly, unable to form a reply. Dr. Evans seemed to understand. She did not push. "Well, just a thought," she said, handing him a small bottle of antiseptic ointment. "Give this a try. It's better than what you're using." She smiled once more, thanked him for the coffee he had made her, and left. Rick stood in the middle of his cabin for a long time after she was gone. The fortress walls, which had been breached by gratitude, now felt like they were in danger of crumbling entirely. The outside world was no longer just whispering about him. It was actively inviting him in. The thought was terrifying. But as he looked at the small wooden wolf still sitting on the mantel, he also felt a tiny, unfamiliar flicker of something else. Something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very, very long time. Dr. Evans's suggestion echoed in the quiet cabin for weeks, a persistent, unsettling ripple in the calm waters of Rick's solitude. The winter fair. The words themselves conjured images of everything he had fought to escape. Crowds, noise, cheerful music, and the pressing, expectant faces of strangers. His first gut reaction was a hard and absolute no. The fortress walls, though breached by kindness, were still necessary. To willingly walk out of them and into the heart of the town felt like a tactical surrender, a foolish exposure of his most vulnerable flank. He tried to push the thought away, focusing on his work, on the familiar rhythm of his life with Duke. But something had fundamentally shifted. When he looked at his carvings now, he did not just see the wood. He saw Sergeant Miller's lopsided grin. He saw the quiet intensity in Doc Jensen's eyes. These were not just objects anymore. They were testaments. And keeping them hidden away in the shadows felt, for the first time, like a disservice. The true battle was fought in the long, quiet evenings. He would sit by the fire, wrestling with his fear, while Duke lay at his feet. The dog, now healthy and strong, his gray and white coat thick and clean, had become the calm center of Rick's world. One night, as Rick's anxiety was particularly sharp, his hands clenched as he thought of the crowded fair, Duke seemed to sense it. He rose, walked over, and rested his heavy head on Rick's knee, looking up with those deep, steady amber eyes. There was no question in them, only a simple, profound trust. Rick looked down at the dog, this creature he had walked into a hurricane to save. Duke was not meant to live his entire life in the shadows of the forest, hidden away with a broken man. He deserved to walk in the sun. In that moment, Rick understood. Courage was not the absence of fear. It was acting in spite of it. He had faced down armed enemies, but for years he had been running from friendly faces. It was time for a new kind of bravery. "All right, boy," Rick whispered, his hand resting on Duke's head. "All right, we'll go." On the day of the winter fair, Rick carefully wrapped his 3 best carvings, the hawk, the bear, and the wolf, in old, soft blankets, and placed them in a wooden crate. He loaded the crate into the back of his truck. Duke, seeming to sense the importance of the day, hopped into the passenger seat without being told, his tail giving a single, decisive thump against the worn upholstery. The fair was a blaze of cheerful light and sound, set up in the town's central square. Colorful stalls lined the walkways, selling everything from handmade quilts to hot cider. The air smelled of cinnamon, roasting nuts, and pine. For a moment, the old panic flared in Rick's chest. The urge to turn the truck around and flee back to the silence of the woods was immense. Then he felt Duke shift beside him, a warm, solid presence. He was not alone. He was a 2-man team on a mission. He found the small booth Dr. Evans had reserved for him at the edge of the fair, slightly away from the main throng of the crowd. He set up a simple wooden table and, with trembling hands, unwrapped his carvings and set them out. They looked small and wild amidst the festive decorations. Rick stood behind the table, his shoulders rigid, with Duke lying on a blanket at his feet. He had his anchor. He could do this. At first, people passed by, their eyes sliding over the quiet man and his strange, dark carvings. They recognized him as the hermit, and old habits died hard. Then, a small, determined figure broke away from her parents and walked straight to his booth. It was Lily Peterson. "Hi, Duke," she said, kneeling down to gently scratch the dog behind his ears. Duke licked her hand. Tom and Sarah Peterson followed, their faces warm with genuine smiles. "These are beautiful, Rick," Sarah said, her eyes on the wooden hawk. "Truly. How much for this one?" The transaction was awkward, but it broke the ice. People saw the exchange. Their curiosity piqued. They began to drift over, drawn in by the raw, undeniable talent in the carvings. They saw the life in the wood, the fierce spirit in the wolf's eyes, the powerful grace in the hawk's wings. They spoke to him in hushed, respectful tones. "Did you really carve this by hand? It looks so real." Rick's answers were short, never more than a few words. "Yes, thank you." But his brevity was no longer seen as strange or hostile. It was seen as the quiet humility of a true artist. He did not have to say much. The work spoke for him. And through it all, his left hand was never far from Duke's head, the steady, rhythmic motion of stroking the dog's fur, keeping the panic at bay. He saw Dr. Evans, who gave him a thumbs up from across the way. He saw Sheriff Brody, who walked past and gave him a slow, deliberate nod of respect. By the end of the afternoon, all 3 carvings were sold. He had not made a fortune, but that was never the point. He packed up his empty crate, his pockets full of money he hadn't expected, and his mind full of faces that had looked at him not with fear, but with admiration. That evening, the air was cold and sharp, and the sky was a deep, velvet black, studded with 1,000,000,000 stars. Rick did not sit inside. He sat on the front porch, on the new, sturdy step he had built the day before to replace the one that was rotted through. Duke sat beside him, leaning his solid weight against Rick's leg. From here, through a gap in the trees, they could see the distant, twinkling lights of Havenwood. For years, those lights had represented a world that had rejected him, a world of noise and pain that he had turned his back on. But tonight, they looked different. They looked like a harbor. He looked down at the magnificent animal at his side. This dog, this wounded stray he had saved, had in turn done the impossible. He had led him out of the fortress. He had walked with him back into the world. The cabin behind them no longer felt like a fortress to hide in, a place to escape the world. It felt like a home, a sanctuary to return to after a long day, a place of peace, not a place of exile. Rick wrapped his arm around Duke's shoulders, pulling the dog close. He had found a kind of peace he never thought possible, not by shutting the world out, but by finding one, right connection to it. It had all started with a howl in the wind and a choice to step out into the storm. He had gone out looking for a ghost, and in the end, he had found his own shadow, a loyal, 4-legged companion who had quietly, patiently led him all the way home. Sometimes, the very life you believe you are saving is the one that ends up saving you. Rick and Duke's journey shows us that true healing begins not when we build stronger walls, but when we find the courage to open a door for another soul. If their story has touched your heart, we invite you to become part of our community so we can continue to share tales of hope and connection. We would be honored to read about the loyal companion who changed your world in the comments below. By sharing this video, you help spread a powerful message, and your journey with us can continue with our next story, waiting for you right now on the screen.